بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قلنا اهبطوا منها جميعا فإما يأتينكم مني هدى فمن تبع هداي فلا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum brothers. Jazakallah khair for attending our monthly Collingwood Circle. Today's presentation inshallah will be on Sulayman alayhi salam. It is our penultimate session where we're looking at prophets and messengers. We have Brother Saf Chaudhry who will be making the presentation. Jazakallah khair for me personally because I know how busy you are. The brother is well versed and I think I've said, we saw the credentials in terms of his studying and his background, inshallah. He's currently doing a PhD in Sufism. He's also been to Al-Azhar University. So after, inshallah, his presentation for about half an hour, 40 minutes, there'll be a good opportunity, inshallah, for you to ask questions and comments. And then there will be refreshments, tea and biscuits at the end, inshallah, for everybody. So feel free to hang around. There isn't really a time. We've got until 10 o'clock in the hall, so there's plenty of time, inshallah, to have a good presentation, a discussion, and then some light refreshments in the end, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي هدانا بكتاب مبين وأنزل علينا القرآن بلسان عربي مبين وقص فيه أحسن القصص موعظة وذكرى للمؤمنين والصلاة والسلام على الصادق الأمين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه هم الهداة للمتقين. يقول الله تبارك وتعالى بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد بعدد من صلى وصام وبارك على محمد بعدد ما قعد وقام وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Brothers, Jazakumullahu khairan, and I welcome you all. I thank the brothers here for inviting me down to this session on the hayat of the Anbiya alayhim as-salam. Now I know our topic, or our Nabi, is Sulayman alayhi salam. But before I do begin, I want to just mention the little background that we should bear in mind when we're studying the Anbiya alayhim salam. But just before I do mention a few points about that, I want to mention something even prior to that, when it comes to the Quran in general. Imam al-Qurtubi, does anyone know who Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah is? Faddal.
I don't know the details.
Okay, that's fine. Just, has anyone heard of the name?
Yeah.
If you want to continue. Yeah, does anyone know who he is?
Mufassir? Yeah.
He's a mufassir, which means an interpreter of the Quran. Does anyone know where he was from?
Cordoba.
Yeah, Cordoba in Spain, in Al-Andalusia, Al-Andalus. Qurtub was a big city in Al-Andalus, in southern Spain, or that Iberian peninsula, where Islam was there for about 800 years. So Imam al-Qurtubi originally was from Cordoba in Spain, and then he went to Upper Egypt and he sort of settled there and he passed away there, rahimahullah. Now he wrote a massive commentary of the Quran known as Al-Jami' li ahkam al-Quran, the huge compendium of interpreting the legal verses of the Quran. It's a masterpiece of Quranic tafsir, interpretation. And in the first volume, he quotes from a book. This is another name. You might not have heard of this name, but alhamdulillah, brothers have heard of this name. From one of the early Zuhad, one of the early ascetic figures. His name was Al-Hakim At-Tirmidhi. Now this is not the Tirmidhi who wrote the hadith book, the Sunan, but Hakim At-Tirmidhi. Has anyone heard of that name? Anyway, we should know about Al-Hakim At-Tirmidhi. Anyway, it's one of the early Zuhad, one of the great ascetics, someone who was very spiritually oriented. Now, Al-Hakim At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah, wrote a book called Nawadir al-Usul fi ma'rifati ahadith al-Rasul. He wrote a book on how to approach the Quran and understand the hadith of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wa taslim. And Imam al-Qurtubi quotes about 37 points that a person should have when they approach the Quran. So when you're studying the Quran, when you're reading it, when you're carrying it, when you're handling it, there are adab and there are what they call inviolabilities or hurmat. There are some behavior you should have towards the Quran because it's the Quran. It's not in your book. It's not in your book from a library. It's the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he lists about 37 points. And I want to mention 3 for us today, for us to bear in mind when we approach any talk on the Quran, or approach our own personal study, or in a halaqah, or in a dars, or something like that. And Imam al-Qurtubi, he quotes from Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah. This is one of the etiquettes we should have towards the Quran. He says, وَمِنْ حُرْمَتِهِ أَنْ يَسْتَعْمَلَ ذَهْنَهُ وَفَهَمَهُ حَتَّى يَعْقِلْ مَا يُخَاطَبْ بِهِ. He says, one of the inviolabilities of the Quran, one of the things that you must have when you approach the Quran, is what? أَنْ يَسْتَعْمِلْ ذَهْنَهُ, is to use your mind and focus and attention when you're approaching the Quran. Yeah, this book is going to need your attention and your focus. وَفَهَمَهُ, and your understanding. For what? حَتَّى يَعْقِلْ مَا يُخَاطَبْ بِهِ, so that you can understand what Allah is trying to say in it. At the end of the day, the reason why we study anything, whether that's the Arabic language, whether that is tafsir, whether that is hadith, primarily the ulama says, is to understand the tashri'. What is Allah telling us to do or not to do? Ultimately, that is the primary reason why we study tafsir. In fact, one of the definitions of tafsir has in it understanding the Quran so that we can extract the ruling, the hukum shara'i from it. So first thing to bear in mind is that when we're approaching the Quran, we've got to employ our intellects, our mind, so that we can understand what Allah is trying to tell us to do. Primarily, that's what we're trying to do when we're approaching the Quran. So that's the first thing, trying to understand what Allah is saying by employing our intellects. So it's an intellectual exercise of the Quran. It's not a passive thing, you don't read it, absorb it, although you get reward, that's not enough. There has to be an active engagement with the text. Yeah? Then he says, وَمِنْ حُرْمَتِهِ, and then one of the other inviolabilities, أَنْ يَقِفَ عَلَى آيَاتِ الْوَعْدِ. The other thing is that when you approach the Quran, you should try, when you read it, you should pause at the verses that mention the wa'ad, the good promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? فَيَرْغَبْ إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَيَسْأَلُهُمْ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. So why? So when you read about the verses that talks about Allah's good promise, paradise, reward, all of these things, why? So then you can have a desire to ask Allah for these things. At the end of the day, every soul, every ruh yearns to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Doesn't matter who it is. It came from Allah, it will go on to go back to Allah. And Allah tells us that there's lots of rewards in store for those who follow His commands and stay away from His prohibition. So one of the things we should do when we approach the Quran is when we come to verses that talk about the good promise of Allah, we should pause, reflect on them. Look at the bounty that Allah has promised us. So we have a desire for it and we ask Allah for it. وَأَنْ يَقِفْ عَلَى آيَاتِ الْوَعِيدِ فَيَسْتَجِيرَ بِاللَّهِ مِنْهُ. So when you, similarly, just as you stop at the ayat that talk about the good promise of Allah, we should also stop at the ayat that talk about the wa'id, the threats, and the divine sanctions and punishment that await us if we disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? فَيَسْتَجِيرَ بِاللَّهِ تَعَالَى مِنْهُ. So that we can ask Allah's help to avoid that punishment. To stop at these verses and to ponder over them. Yeah? The third one, he says, وَمِنْ حُرْمَتِهِ أَنْ يَقِفَ عَلَى أَمْثَالِهِ فَيَتَمَثَّلُهَا. And then the third thing that you should do, or one of the other things that you should do, is when you come to the stories of the previous nations, stop and ponder over on them and take them as lessons. So when we approach the Quran, we want to approach the qisas, or the stories related to the as-sabiqat, the previous nations. What happened to them? Why they declined? Why they were halak? Why they fell into destruction? Why Allah destroyed some of them? Why Allah raised some of them and brought them down again? In it is ibrah, a lesson for us. So Imam al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, quoted by Imam al-Qurtubi, is mentioning when you come to the Quran, ponder over these things. There are many, many other things. These three I thought are pertinent for us because we're looking at, or you have looked at other lives of the Anbiya alayhim salam. And we're going to look at now Sulayman alayhi salam. So the first thing to point in mind is that when we approach the Quran, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, we approach it with that in mind. That we want to learn from the lessons that are mentioned in it. We want to learn from the lessons that are mentioned in it. So that we can find the favour and the grace and the fadl of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can avoid His punishment. That's the first point. The second point to bear in mind is that the qissah of the Anbiya, the stories of the Anbiya mentioned in the Quran, they're not fairy tales. Yeah? They're not fairy tales. It's more than Lord of the Rings and Narnia, it's more than that. These are real, these are haqq, these are true. And to not believe in them will take it out of the fold of Islam. So when we are talking about the hayat of the Anbiya, we then therefore should have the utmost humility when we're approaching studying them. They're not any old human beings. They are the best strata of creation. They're not like you and not like me. These are people whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chosen, especially chosen and created for His mission, His providential plan. Allah communicates to them, inspires them, subjugates the natural order to them. Allah hasn't subjugated to you and I. You don't open the sky ain't going to open on your command or my command. We're not going to move the waves apart on your command or my command. So when we approach the hayat of the Anbiya, we have to have utmost humility and reverence. That these aren't ordinary human beings. These are human beings through whom are their interlocutors, the intermediaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth to establish His mission. Third point, that belief in the Anbiya is one of the aspects that form the intellectual basis of our creed, of our aqidah. There are three things that establish the intellectual foundation of our belief. One, belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The belief in Allah is aqli, it's rational. It's not emotional. It's not an accidental belief. It's a rational, solid belief. Based on qa'ida aqliya, based on intellectual proof. Second foundation of our aqidah is the belief that the Quran is a mu'jizah. It's of divine authorship. It's inimitable. Can't be copied by no one. It is the divine, miraculous, unequal, incomparable word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can prove that rationally. That's the second aspect that forms the intellectual basis of our creed. The third aspect that proves or establishes the intellectual basis of our creed is the need and the belief in messengers. So if there is a God, if there is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that exists, and if the Quran is the word of Allah, or if there is a divine communication from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there are people whom Allah chooses and sends who are best placed to tell us how to practically live that divine communication. And that can be established rationally. That's an intellectual evidence. We can prove that rationally. That anyone who sends a manual of an object is best placed to tell you how to run that object and use it. Similarly, the hidayah that comes from Allah, He's the best place to tell us how it should be practically lived and applied. So the belief in Allah, the Quran, and the need for the Rusul and the Anbiya forms the intellectual basis on which our creed is established. They're rational, and we can prove it. We can prove it with intellectual proof. So bear that in mind when we're studying any lives of the Anbiya or any part of the Quran. That one, there's an etiquette involved in approaching, handling and reading the Quran. Two, that when we approach the study of the Anbiya, we have the utmost humility and reverence, because they're not ordinary people like you and I. Three, that it forms part of the aqidah of a Muslim, the denial of which will lead one out of the fold of Islam. So it's a very serious matter. So bear that in mind, my dear brothers, when you're approaching the study of the Anbiya alayhim as-salam, or any aspect of the Quran. So now let us move to the Hayat Tayyibah, the noble life of Sulayman alayhi salam. Now I know there are lots of ways I suppose we can approach it, but what I like to do generally when I go through the Hayat of the Anbiya is I like to follow the tartib of the Quran, the sequence of the Quran, the way it comes in the Quran, the passage, the way it occurs in the Quranic text. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to follow that, and then at some points, because we haven't got much time, because I want to go through most of the passages, if not all of them, I want to stop at some lessons for us to draw while we're going along. Then we can make some broader conclusions, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, at the end. So let us give our attention to the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now with Sulayman alayhi salam, there's not much in compared to other Anbiya alayhi salam, like Musa alayhi salam, or Isa alayhi salam. So we have huge passages in the Quran